on a tandem bicycle with my wife and my oldest son on the back, and we were heading west in the pouring rain for about a week straight. So I realize now that Ireland is different. Now the sun shines here, it doesn't rain here anymore. And back then people were poor, and now I hear everyone's rich in Ireland. So things have changed. There's one thing I also have to say. Truth in labeling forces me to say I did not get my PhD from Harvard University. I got it from Temple University, but the little kid on the back of the bicycle, he went to Harvard University. So I guess that's the source of the confusion. Anyway, in a pastoral letter addressed to the church in Ireland, dated March 19th, 2010, Pope Benedict the 16th claimed that in order to recover from the wound which a number of Irish priests had inflicted on the young people entrusted to their care, the church in Ireland, this is a direct quote, must first acknowledge before the Lord and before others the serious sins committed against defenseless children. Such an acknowledgement, accompanied by sincere sorrow for the damage caused to those victims and their families, must lead to a concerted effort to ensure the protection of children from similar crimes in the future. The Pope based his letter largely on the findings of the Murphy Report, which had been published on November 26, 2009, and which found that child abuse by clerics was widespread throughout the period under review. Now, rather than talk about the widespread nature, I'd like to talk about the period under review, because this is crucial to understanding the sexual crisis. Most of the cases of abuse which the church is now confronting took place in the period whose epicenter is roughly 30 to 40 years ago. In order to understand the crisis, then, we need to understand what Germans call the Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. The times being largely the 1970s, when roughly 10 years after the Second Vatican Council ended, the church was in the process of its implementation. The Pope adverts to this time period in his letter. He says, significant too was the tendency during this period, also on the part of priests and religious, to adopt ways of thinking and assessing secular realities without sufficient reference to the gospel. The program of renewal proposed by the Second Vatican Council was sometimes misinterpreted, and indeed, in the light of the profound social changes that were taking place, it was far from easy to know best how to implement it. One of the main characteristics of this period, according to the Pope, was a well-intentioned but misguided tendency to avoid penal approaches to canonically irregular situations. It is in this overall context that we must try to understand the disturbing problem of child sexual abuse, which has contributed in no small measure to the weakening of the faith and the loss of respect for the church and her teachings. The Murphy Report makes it clear that the church did not apply the remedies which canon law provides in the case of sexual abuse. Instead, the Diocese of Dublin set aside the penal process of canon law in favor of what it called a purely pastoral approach, which was, in the Commission's view, wholly ineffective as a means of controlling clerical child sexual abuse. Pope Benedict was unsparing in his criticism of the priests who betrayed the trust of those they were called to serve, and the bishops who were derelict in exercising proper oversight. But paragraph 4 of his pastoral letter indicates that other forces were at work as well. In recent decades, this is a direct quote, the church in your country has had to confront new and serious challenges to the faith arising from the rapid transformation and secularization of Irish society. Fast-paced social change has occurred, often adversely affecting people's traditional adherence to traditional teaching and values. All too often, the sacramental and devotional practices that sustain faith and enable it to grow, such as frequent confession, daily prayer, and annual retreats, were neglected. Only by examining carefully the many elements that gave rise to the present crisis can a clear-sighted diagnosis of its causes be understood and effective remedies be found. 2 weeks after that statement was issued, a group of Italians under the leadership of Sandro Magistro formed a symposium that appeared on the internet at a website called chiesa.com. And they tried to, in a sense, follow the Pope's direction and find out exactly what was going on here. And as the Pope had indicated, many of these people focused on the period under review, understanding that period, in other words, the 60s, as the key to understanding what had happened. Because in effect, the whole strategy of the press in dealing with this issue was to globalize it, basically, and say it was the church, and the church has always been this way, and so on and so forth, when it's pretty clear that that was not the case. Taking part in this symposium, Angelo Cardinal Bagnasco saw strategies of generalized discredit behind the news reports, as well as more than a little hypocrisy. The media who were calling for the Pope's resignation were the same media which had spent decades undermining sexual morality. And this is what he had to say. In reality, we must all question ourselves without any more alibis about a culture that in our time reigns pampered and uncontested and tends progressively to fray the connective tissue of society as a whole, perhaps even mocking those who try to resist and oppose it. The attitude, that is, of those who cultivate absolute autonomy from the criteria of moral judgment and convey as good and alluring behaviors that are designed according to individual desires and even unbridled instincts. But the exaggeration of sexuality disconnected from its anthropological significance, all-encompassing hedonism and a relativism that does not admit limits or expressions, all this does great harm because they are specious and sometimes so pervasive as to escape notice. Cardinal Ruini joined in the symposium, and he called the crisis in Ireland, quote, part of a strategy that had been underway for centuries, and went on to claim that the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had elaborated this strategy with his flair for detail. Once again, the key to understanding the Irish abuse crisis is understanding the period under review, which is to say the aftermath of the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Professor of Sociology Massimo Introvine, president of the Center for Studies on New Religion, claimed that the attack on the church began in earnest during what the English and the Americans call the 60s, and the Italians, concentrating on the emblematic year of 1968, call Il Sessantotto. This era, according to Professor Introvine, increasingly appears as a time of profound disturbances of customs with crucial and lasting effects on religion. Benedict goes on to say, in the Catholic Church there was not at once a sufficient awareness of the scope of this revolution. What this and similar commentary makes clear is that talking about the 60s and understanding the 60s are two different things. What all the critiques have in common is basically a vague or an inadequate understanding of what happened to the 60s, and more importantly, what happened in the aftermath of the sexual revolution, a period which coincided in time with the implementation of the Second Vatican Council. Cardinal Ruini mentions Nietzsche, who was certainly a villain, but if Cardinal Ruini is interested in talking about a campaign of revolution, a strategy that has been underway for centuries, and a sexualization of culture for political purposes, he would have done better to talk about the Marquis de Sade, who came to power during the French Revolution and was in many ways the architect of the instrumentalization of sexuality for political purposes, which is what we're talking about in this talk and in this period of time. It's not that nobody ever committed a sin against the Sixth Commandment before 1968. We're talking about what over a 200-year period, let's say from 1789 to 1989, the more and more sophisticated manipulation of sexual desire for political effects. That's what we're talking about. Professor Invigne goes on to claim that a single factor cannot explain a revolution of this magnitude. The economic boom and feminism plays a part, but also, more importantly, cultural aspects both outside the church and Christian communities, the encounter between psychoanalysis and Marxism, and inside them, the new theologies also played a role. So he mentions the connection between psychoanalysis and Marxism, but he doesn't mention Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich is the man who created the term sexual revolution, and he is also the man who combined psychoanalysis and Marxism to create a weapon that was specifically targeted against the Catholic Church. I'm talking about the 1930s right now. And even more specifically, one which promoted the sexual corruption of the clergy as the best way of reducing the church's political power. Does that sound relevant to this story? Reich was a Jew from Galicia, the easternmost province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who was both a Freudian and a Marxist. 9 years after his death, he became the hero of the, 9 years after his death in 1959, he became the hero of the '68 revolution in Paris. 2 years later, he was featured on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. Now, this is not a secret here, and yet apparently nobody in this august body of people, this symposium, nobody knew who he was. By the time Reich had been rediscovered by the New Left in 1969, he had been dead for 10 years, but that fact was irrelevant because the Reich that the cultural revolutionaries were interested in promoting had stopped writing in 1933. On January 4th, 1971, Christopher Lehman-Haupt wrote in a review of the new Farrar Straus edition of The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which announced in effect that the Reich revival had begun in earnest. Wilhelm Reich, he proclaimed, the Austrian sexologist and inventor of the so-called orgone energy accumulator, has made a comeback. Reich, according to the review, was the father of youth culture, the father of the sexual revolution, and the father of the feminist movement. Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics, was written under his influence. Beyond that, Reich was better at reconciling Freud and Marx than Marcuse, because by expounding his credo that sexual man was liberated from his need for authority, religion, and marriage, Reich, in their words, makes considerable sense. 4 months later, April 18th, 1971, the New York Times returned to Reich, this time devoting a feature-length article in their Sunday magazine to his thought. In Wilhelm Reich, the psychiatrist as revolutionary, David Elkin described how student communards in Berlin and Paris pelted police with soft-bound copies of Reich's book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. I've often wondered, why didn't they throw hardbound books? Were they too expensive, or were they being compassionate against the police? We'll never know. Reich was being resurrected everywhere in Europe as a hero saint to students demanding social reform. And now many American young people, this continues the quote, now discovering that Reich is very much their kind of revolutionary too. This was because his message was more appealing to the American left, who felt that they could now bring down the state by sexual license without the sublimation urged by Freud or the political revolution urged by Marx. Reich is relevant to our discussion for two reasons. Okay? First of all, he was a proponent of child sexuality, and number two, he was a proponent of sexual subversion of the clergy. Let me deal with the second issue first. He was a communist organizer in Austria during the 1920s and 1930s, and he noticed that during these organization efforts, he would start talking about the fourth thesis of the Third International, and everyone's eyes would glaze over and people would start heading for the exit, and he couldn't get a crowd together. But he said he noticed as soon as I would talk about sex, everyone's attention snapped to, and it was easy to keep a group together. So he used this as a way of mobilizing what he thought was going to be the revolutionary forces in Austria, which you probably know was a Catholic country at this time. And so what we're doing is we're going to bring about the overthrow of the Catholic powers that are in control of this culture. Now, the priests obviously play an important role in a Catholic country. They play an important role in any country, but certainly for upholding the social order in a Catholic country. And what he found is that he said in his book, it's pointless to debate with priests. It's pointless to debate things like the existence of God. What you need to do is get the priest involved in sexual activity. And once the seminarian or priest is involved in sexual activity, the idea of God, he says, evaporates from their mind. And so what you have here is a crude and early form of social engineering, which means basically don't try and change people's minds, change their environment or change their behavior, and then you don't have to worry about their minds. That's what he was talking about. But as I said, that's only half the story. Reich also urged upon revolutionaries what he felt the most important thing that he had to say was that no revolution will succeed until we can sexualize children. This is not something that was just a passing thing. It was crucial to his whole philosophy of revolution. In The Mass Psychology of Fascism, Reich praised, quote, the genuine sociologists who will reckon psychoanalysis' comprehension of childhood sexuality as a highly significant revolutionary act. With the restriction and suppression of sexuality, the nature of human feelings changes. A sex-negating religion comes into being, that's Catholicism, and gradually develops its own sex-political organization. The Church, with all its predecessors, the aim of which is nothing more than the eradication of man's sexual desires and consequently of what little happiness is here on earth. According to Reich, sexual inhibition prepares the average adolescent from thinking and feeling in a rational way. Of course, the exact opposite is true. The first step to revolution, he continued, is the promotion of childhood sexuality. Sexual revolution is, to use his terms, social dynamite, but it cannot work its destructive force if the revolutionaries are afraid of involving children in sexual behavior. Or as Reich puts it, if this work is to be carried out by revolutionaries who vie with the Church in the asseveration and advocacy of moralistic mysticism, in other words, if you want to combat the mysticism of the Church, if it's carried out by revolutionaries who view the answering of sexual questions as being beneath the dignity of revolutionary ideology, or if it's carried out by revolutionaries who dismiss childhood masturbation as a bourgeois invention, then revolution won't work. In other words, the true revolutionary must be willing to promote the sexualization of children. I could give you quote after quote, I'll just give you two. In the main, revolutionary work with children can only be sex economic work. Overcome your astonishment and listen patiently. Why is it that children in the pre-pubertal stage can be directed by sexual education in the best and easiest way? Well, that's because the mechanism that makes the masses of people incapable of freedom is the social suppression of genital sexuality in small children, adolescents, and adults. So if you want to bring about a revolution, you have to sexualize the children. The true revolutionary must be willing to promote this sex with children. Now, as I indicated, Reich's theories were expressed in the 1930s, but they were put into practice in the 1960s. And I mean this in a very literal sense. It would take decades before the putting of this into practice would find its effect. It was like a time bomb that was waiting to go off. That time bomb went off in Germany in February of 2001. Right around that time, I did a translation of an article which appeared in a German magazine called Die Aula, and it appeared in Culture Wars, called Green Pedophilia, Danny and the Daycare Center. The Danny in question here was Daniel Cohn-Bendit. And whether you've heard of him, if you haven't, he is head of the Green Party in France and a member of the European Parliament. In those days, Mr. Cohn-Bendit was in charge of a daycare center. It wasn't any daycare center. It was the daycare center run by Kommune 2 in Frankfurt. It was a left-wing group, a group of Reichians. And guess what? They were putting into practice. They were putting Wilhelm Reich's philosophy into practice with the children of the left. In his book, Linke Lebenslügen, eine überfällige Rechnung, Left-Wing Lies About Life, a Long Overdue Reckoning, Klaus Reiner Pohl, who was then husband of the RAF terrorist Ulrike Meinhof, goes into some detail about the child-rearing practices in Kommune 2, which specialized in raising children according to the gospel of Wilhelm Reich. The first goal of this education was to replace the attachment of the child to the parents and with a relationship to a relationship person and inhibit the formation of authoritarian family fixation. These activities included pedophilic contact between adults and children as young as 5, the details of which I will spare you. But apparently someone in the TV industry in Germany knows how to read and picked up this book and started reading it. And the crucial factor at this point was that the Green Party had now come into power in Germany. Joschka Fischer, if you remember him, was now the foreign minister. And somebody put 2 and 2 together and realized that Joschka Fischer and Daniel Cohn-Bendit were comrades in arms during this period of time. So Daniel Cohn-Bendit was invited to an interview with one of the 3 major TV channels, ZDF, in Germany. And he was asked at this in this interview whether he was ever employed in one of these so-called red daycare centers. Yes, of course, he replied. And then the reporter asked him if he had published the following text about his experiences there. Quote, "It often happened to me that children would unzip my fly and begin to fondle me," is what he wrote in his memoir. At that point, the eloquent head of the Green Party had the look of a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. After lots of hemming and hawing, Cohn-Bendit said that he wouldn't recommend now what he recommended then because, quote, "we know a lot more about child abuse." But the reporter and then he said, "I never had anything to do with children." Somehow the reporter didn't seem convinced, and so he continued, "It sounds so autobiographical. The descriptions are so personal, as if you had sex with children." Cohn-Bendit replied, "Yeah, but it's not true. It's not true. The same thing goes for the parents. I'm not mad if people accuse me of that because it was no secret." Wait a minute, I thought you said it wasn't true. "I was only thinking that you have to look at it in the context of this time and period. We're talking about 1968. That was then." Now, unlike the Catholic Church, which has apologized for priests who have engaged in sexual activity with children, the left in general and the Green Party, as its current heir, has never apologized and never, quote, sought ways to repair the damage that they have done to the children of that generation, who were treated like guinea pigs by being subjected to the theories of Wilhelm Reich. Again, Klaus Reiner Pohl, it is in this particular area that the movement has the most to answer for. These evil or stupid deeds have created the biggest aftershock for the movement. It was here that it did its most damage. Writing around the same time as Hans Fingeler, Herbert Rauter claims that Cohn-Bendit's experiences were no isolated incident. In fact, in 1985, the Green Party, the political home of both Cohn-Bendit and Joschka Fischer, advocated the elimination of laws criminalizing sexual relations with children, claiming they prevent the free development of the personality, close quote. At the beginning of 1985, the Greens proposed legislation which would decriminalize the sexual seduction of girls under 16 years of age, as well as homosexual contact with children and teenagers. Their reason, the threat of punishment inhibits children from discovering their true sexual orientation. I could go on and on. The Green Party platform throughout the 1980s this is a party platform. One of their demands throughout the 80s was the decriminalization of all sexual activity between adults and children. Throughout the 80s. Okay, so let's just take a deep breath and sum up here. What are we talking about? Christopher Hitchens, you probably heard of him. He's a drunk and now he's a sodomite. He's making that as a career move. He just he's written a book extolling atheism and another book attacking Mother Teresa. And he is planning to arrest the Pope when the Pope arrives in England in September. But no one is talking about arresting Daniel Cohn-Bendit. The church has never condoned this sort of activity, but the Green Party has. No one is suing the Green Party for the sexual molestation that took place in their daycare centers in the 60s, but lots of people are suing the Catholic Church. Now, is this a double standard? Well, yeah, it is a double standard. The church is being held to a standard that no one else is being held to, and this is the infallible sign to me that what we're talking about here is instrumentalization. In other words, don't let a good crisis go to waste, as Rahm Emanuel said recently. That is the motto of the people in America. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. And so here we have a crisis that is now being exploited for a particular political end. That's what I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk about that political end. But I'd also like to say that, put the whole era in context. It turns out that Gaudium et Spes was wrong when it claimed that the church had nothing to fear from the modern world. It turns out that we should fear the modern world. But the worst thing that happened to the church, though, in this period of time, it seems to me, was that it gave up the idea that it had enemies. The church is always going to have enemies. But in this period of time, it adopted the idea that dialogue was going to somehow reconcile our enemies to the church. That never happened. It will never happen. It can never happen. It was a totally utopian project that was, in many ways, different than the Vatican Council documents, but it grew out of the Vatican Council documents. Professor Invigna tries to address that when he says there was a sessantotto, there was a 68 in society, and there was also a sessantotto in the church. 1968 is itself a year of public dissent against the Humanae Vitae of Paul VI, a dispute that, according to a valuable and influential study by the recently deceased American philosopher Ralph McInerney, What Went Wrong with Vatican II, represents a point of no return in the crisis of the principle of authority in the church. Now, when I read that, it struck a chord because I read it shortly after Ralph McInerney died. And I spent the last 6 weeks of his life visiting him. But more importantly, I spent about 15 years of having lunch with Ralph McInerney, 10 years maybe, in the period leading up to that book. And when the book came out, I was just bitterly disappointed in that book. Because there were things that I knew, there were things that I told him, there were things that we both acknowledged as being true over Chinese food at these lunches, and they did not make it into the book. And I thought, at this point, how is anybody supposed to know what has happened to us if you are not going to tell them in the book you wrote? Now, there's one main thing in that book that he did not talk about, and that was the role that Notre Dame University played in the destruction of the faith of Catholics in America. Now, it may be the case because he was a professor at Notre Dame and had been there for 50 years. I don't know. We never really got around to talking about that. But what I'm trying to say here is that this story, as I'm trying to indicate, it didn't begin in March of 2010, didn't begin in 1968. I mean, we could say it began with Adam and Eve, but that's too far back. I'm saying that it was part of a war that had been going on in America ever since the 1930s. And the war in this country, I once wrote a book about Medjugorje, which earned me a lot of enemies. But it meant going to Medjugorje, and it meant going to Yugoslavia, and it meant figuring out what Yugoslavia was. It was a country that was divided up between three ethnic groups based on three religions: Croat, Serb, and Muslim. And after doing that, I thought, this is America. America is Yugoslavia, except instead of Croat, Serb, and Muslim, it's Protestant, Catholic, Jew. Three ethnic groups, always at covert war with each other. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the time when my grandfather left Cork and went to Philadelphia in 1900. He was part of a despised minority who was brought there for one reason, namely cheap labor, which is the reason all of us Americans are in America, especially the black Americans who were free labor to a certain extent. And he grew up under certain conditions, and the church of that time existed under those conditions. And they knew the church then was different. They knew they had enemies. And they knew that weren't just personal enemies, that there were certain formal reasons why we had enemies, and that our enemies were basically the Protestants and the Jews. And the church understood that it was in a weak position, but it stood up against these groups of people. I can give you two particular instances. The Rockefeller family was a very influential family, and they tried to persuade the United States government to get into contraception, government distribution of contraception during the 1930s. There was a man by the name of Monsignor John Ryan, an Irishman who grew up in Minnesota, and he gave a powerful speech before the Congress of the United States, in which he said basically that the reason that the Rockefellers want the government to get involved in birth control is because they and their people do not want to pay the working man a decent wage. And this is to distract from their exploitation of the working man. And he defeated the most powerful people in the United States, and they never forgot that. That was the Protestants. On the other hand, there were the Jews who controlled Hollywood. And they were turning out movies that were full of nudity and ridicule of the clergy and blasphemy. And it's hard to believe, but that's what these movies were like in the 1920s. And the Protestants, in a sense, realized they couldn't fight it, so the Catholics stepped up. And Cardinal Doherty of Philadelphia, another Irishman, called a boycott of all the Warner Brothers theaters in Philadelphia. Now, this is at the heart of the Depression. Hollywood has gone into deep debt in 1929 to finance the technology for talking pictures. And there was a man by the name of Joe Breen, another Irishman, who was at a meeting of the Hollywood moguls, and he wrote a letter back, and he said, Harry Warner is crying tears as big as horse turds because he's losing $100,000 a week in Philadelphia alone. Now, this was the situation before the Vatican Council in America. By the time of the Vatican Council rolled around, there was a whole different world. This 30 years had changed America to the point where the church was no longer united. In simple terms, the Rockefellers, the same people who lost to Monsignor Ryan, found a man within the church who was going to do their bidding. That man was Father Theodore Hesburgh. He's head of Notre Dame University. He was head of Notre Dame University. He's still living there now. And he was approached by the Rockefellers to put on a series of secret conferences at the University of Notre Dame, beginning in 1962 and going to 1965. And during that series of secret conferences, these people, these Catholic theologians, were essentially told what to read, they were told what to say, and they were told what to think. And in 1965, a group of theologians just came out. Catholics would open their diocesan newspapers and they read, a group of theologians suddenly discovered or felt that the Catholic teaching on contraception was no longer persuasive. Now, we from the outside were supposed to think, oh, it was just these theologians praying, with Denziger open in one side and the Bible on the other, and they all came to the same conclusion because great minds run in the same circles. No, it wasn't that. It was paid for as a deliberate subversion of the Catholic Church's teaching on sexuality. Why is that? Because demographic power is the source of political power, and the Rockefellers were smart enough to know that. And they knew that the Catholics were having children and that the Protestants were not. And because of that, a Catholic had been elected President of the United States. And now it was time to stop that. And it took a man from within inside the church to do that. Now, I told Ralph McInerney that. I told him this story. I also told him another story. I'd gone to the Rockefeller archives. I looked up the folder on Father Hesburgh, and there is the story of Father Hesburgh takes John D. Rockefeller to Rome and organizes a private audience with Pope Paul VI. And during this private audience, John D. Rockefeller volunteered to write the Pope's birth control encyclical for him. Now, I'm sure the Pope was flattered to hear this. When I was young, people used to say to me, if you're so damn smart, why aren't you rich? The only thing I can think of the Pope saying at this point to Mr. Rockefeller is, if you're so damn rich, why aren't you smart? I got this from the archives. I told this to Ralph. Ralph knew this, and the book comes out, and suddenly the book is like a large donut with a big hole in the middle. Now, why weren't we talking about this? I mention this because the smartest people in Rome, and I'm calling these people that I quoted, they're intelligent people, they're smart people, they're not playing with a full deck. They don't know what happened. They don't know because I know the book that they read, and I know what was left out of that book. And if you don't know this story, if you think that Nietzsche was the cause of this, you're off by about 100 years. If you don't know who Wilhelm Reich is, you don't know what happened. If you don't know what Father Hesburgh was doing with the Rockefeller money, you don't know what happened. And I think that is the situation in the church right now. We don't know what happened. Now, what happened here? What happened after this? After this, there was this huge rebellion in the church. Some of you may remember it. It happened in 1968. It began at Catholic University, and it was theologians rebelling against the church. The rebellion was out in the open. This is the revolution that we're talking about. And the main focus of it in America was the Catholic Church, to weaken the Catholic Church, to destroy the Catholic Church as a moral guide to the nation in general and the Catholic people in particular, to get them to start practicing things that they knew were wrong, like contraception. That's what happened, and Notre Dame played a leading role in this thing. The summer of 1965 was in many ways a reverse of what happened between 1933 and 1935. The victories that were won in 1935 against Hollywood were undone in 65. The Legion of Decency was overthrown in 1965, and as a result, pornography flooded into the theaters, so that by 1973, two of the top grossing films in first-run theaters were Deep Throat and The Devil and Miss Jones. That's within 7 years of breaking the code, of people who said, oh no, it's going to be great theatrical art. The other thing was, in 1965, the Supreme Court struck down laws making the sale of contraceptives illegal. And once that happened, the United States was soon telling everybody in the world how many children they were allowed to have. Population control spread all over the world. That was always the plan of the Rockefellers. But the target of this was always the church, and so what happened is that the social engineering started to work on the clergy, because Reich said that the clergy were the root of the problem. And so there was a group of nuns in Los Angeles, the Immaculate Heart nuns, and the psychologist Carl Rogers showed up at their door and decided to update the nuns, because nuns needed to be updated because of Vatican II. And so he introduced sensitivity training to the nuns, which means basically you can say whatever comes to your mind, and no matter how hurtful it is, and the net result was he destroyed this order of nuns. He renewed them out of existence. 20 years later, a lady wrote a book called Lesbian Nuns, and it turns out that one of the lesbian nuns was in the Immaculate Heart Order that Carl Rogers had destroyed. She had been liberated from the Catholic Church. She had been liberated from her moral scruples and had become a lesbian as a result. He's not the only one who was doing this. April 17, 1962, Abraham Maslow gave a lecture to a group of nuns at Sacred Heart College in Massachusetts. Afterwards, he noted in his diary that his talk had been very successful, but he found this fact troubling. Quote, "They shouldn't applaud me," he continued, "they should attack. If they were fully aware of what I was doing, they would attack." Well, what were you doing, Abe? You were undermining the basis of their community in the name of liberation. This reached its culmination in 1972 when the American bishops commissioned a survey of the priesthood. The man who did this survey was then a Maryknoll priest by the name of Eugene Kennedy. He then, after that, ran off and got married, which must have been on his mind at this time. But anyway, the basis of this, the man's psychological orientation was provided for him by a psychologist by the name of Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson's real name was Erik Samuelson. He was of the same persuasion as Sigmund Freud. As a matter of fact, he was a student of Sigmund Freud. So here you have a Catholic priest applying the theories of Sigmund Freud to the priesthood in America to see whether they're psychologically healthy or not. Well, Mr. Erikson had a theory, a scale of psychological maturity. There were 9 stages. The highest stage was psychologically mature. Stage 6 involved sexual intercourse. So according to this scale, you could not be psychologically mature unless you had sexual intercourse. Well, you're applying this to a celibate clergy. Guess what? You have 2 alternatives. You can either condemn yourself to being psychologically immature, or you can go out and have sex. Both of which had disastrous consequences for the Catholic Church in America and the world, I would say. There's a book that an article we published in Culture Wars, Beyond Asceticism by a Catholic doctor by the name of Patrick Guinan, another Irishman. There must be other Americans who came from someplace other than Ireland, but they don't show up in my story here. He goes on to blame Kennedy for the priest scandals that we're having right now. He says the connection is perfectly clear. Remember, this is the period we're talking about. This is when all of this stuff was happening. 1972 is when the survey came out. If you look at these details, it's all pretty much mid-70s to mid-80s when all of these acts of pedophilia are committed. This is what Pat Guinan has to say. When Psychological Investigations was published in 1972, it relied on Erikson's and Freud's materialist psychology, which posited unrestrained sexual behavior as inevitable and healthy. Seminary formation programs as well as individual priests accepted Kennedy uncritically, and in an effort to move beyond stage 6 and become normal through sexual intimacy, began acting out sexually. Since priests, many of whom were homosexually inclined, had ready access to adolescent males, this vulnerable group of victims was disproportionately targeted. Now, to understand that part of it, you have to understand that at this time, Notre Dame was also having summer schools for Catholic nuns and priests where they were being updated, and lo and behold, the Catholic nuns and priests were now told that all that stuff about celibacy was going to pass away, and they started holding hands as they were walking around the lake and fell in love and got married and left. Lots of them left during this period of time, which meant that what you had happened over this period of time is the percentage of homosexuals in the clergy began to rise. As the heterosexuals leave, the only people who are left are homosexuals. And that then again led to the scandal. Now you're telling a higher percentage of homosexuals in the clergy that they have to have sexual activity, otherwise they're going to be considered psychologically immature. Now, the church, what is the church's problem here? The church has this problem of internalizing the commands of its oppressors. Why is it listening to people like this? Why is it listening to people like this? Well, I found myself talking to a young lady at a conference in Maynooth, and she couldn't understand this. And I guess in a sense, many had to be there to understand it. But suddenly it was a new age was dawning, and all these ideas were going, and the first thing that goes is your sense of sexual morality, or your sense of inhibition. Your sense of saying, no, I can't act on that desire. That's the first thing that goes. And so as a result, you have a homosexual clergy. And now, you may have noticed, there are groups of people out there who say that homosexuality has nothing to do with the sex abuse crisis in the church. And they are saying that the church has no right to deny homosexuals ordination. Now this is an accident waiting to happen. You're demanding that the Catholic Church accept these people as part of its clergy. You are saying that you have no right to impose upon them any type of rule, and yet you're going to come down like a ton of bricks when they act on what you told them to do. I'll give you one instance that just happened. During the debate of this federal health care, the Obamacare thing that just happened, all of the major Jewish organizations signed a friend of the court brief demanding that the Obama administration allow the Catholic Church no exceptions of conscience when it comes to hiring homosexuals. You have to hire homosexuals. And if any of them act out, then we're going to sue you out of existence. This is the position that the church backed itself into. It was a situation that could not last. And there was a reaction. There was a reaction. Okay, there was a political reaction that began when Nixon was elected. It continued. There was a church, an inside the church reaction that happened when a group like Catholics United for the Faith was formed in reaction to the rebellion at Catholic University by Charles Curran and all those people. I myself was part of this reaction. I was hired as an assistant professor of American literature at St. Mary's College, which is right across the street from Notre Dame. And I arrived there in 1979. And when I was being hired, I said, what's the connection between feminism and Catholicism at this college? Well, they said, that was a real interesting question, and they never got around to answering. Well, I had to find out the hard way what that was, because I wrote articles against abortion, and I got fired for writing articles against abortion at a Catholic college. And I thought, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with this picture. It's like mistaken identity. You know, I'm not the person you think I am. But what had happened was the story that I had told you. The revolutionaries had taken over institutions like Notre Dame. They had taken over institutions like St. Mary's. And the situation was so psychologically tense that anyone who brought up the church's teaching on sexuality in a significant or serious way would be fired, because the reaction was the anger and whatever it was so bad that that's what happened. And that's what happened to me. And so I became part of this reaction. 1988, there was a 20th anniversary celebration of Humanae Vitae, and I realized there were all these people who were sort of gathered around and were trying to fight the sexual revolution in their own way. But nothing stands still, and so what happened is the reaction was hijacked. And that's a story that can be summed up in one word, namely neoconservatism. I don't know whether you've heard of this word over here, but it was defined by Bill Kristol, who was the son of Irving Kristol, who is the father of neoconservatism. He wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. He says, you have to look into the etymology of the word neocon. Neo means con, neo means new, and con means Jew. That's what he said in the New York Times. Okay, so I'm not making this up. What it was, we're back to square one. Life in America is always ethnic struggle. It's always Catholics fighting Protestants or Catholics fighting Jews, except now there was a political alliance in which the lion was going to lie down with the lamb. And what happened is the lamb, and namely the Catholic Church, got taken to the cleaners. It lost out once again, okay? And so as a result, beginning with Ronald Reagan, who mobilized the Catholics, stole them away from the Democratic Party, promised them they was going to put an end to abortion. For 30 years, the Republicans promised the Catholics the moon and ended up giving them nothing. Nothing. And the result was, there's one book by a man named Benjamin Ginsburg a Jewish writer who talked about this from the inside. He said, if you talk to the neocons personally, in private, they will say that they only use issues like abortion to get votes from the riffraff, or the goyim, as they probably say. So in other words, the Catholics got themselves involved in a political movement, and we're going to be the counter-revolution. And it turns out they were fooled. They were all taken for a ride. And the net result was that they got conned into supporting something they never should have supported, namely a crooked economic enterprise. One of the magazines that got founded in reaction to my magazine was First Things. It was founded by a man by the name of Richard John Newhouse. He got $250,000 from the Bradley Foundation, which was controlled at that time by two neocons, Norman Podhoretz, Midge Decter, and also by Irving Kristol. At that time, there was a deal going around. I was cut out. I'm waiting to sell out, but I never get an offer. You know? It's like I'm waiting to sell my soul to the devil, and they come up with like, well, how about $29.95 and bus fare? So I'm holding out for $35. Anyway, the one guy who did get the offer here was a man by the name of Dale Vree, who was the editor of the New Oxford Review. And he got his big chance when a Jewish donor from the East Coast showed up at his offices and offered him money if this was the deal. This is the deal. This has been published. He published in his magazine. Conditions of the deal. Number one, you have to support free market economics. You have to support a muscular American foreign policy. So in other words, capitalism and the war in Iraq, and we'll give you all the money you want. And then you can go on and on about abortion, because nobody's going to do anything about abortion anyway. That was the neoconservative agenda. As of 1992, those people perceived a threat on the horizon. That threat was another Irishman known as Pat Buchanan, who decided to run for president, and they pulled out all the stops to destroy Pat Buchanan. Now, as of 1992, we can now come back to Ireland, knowing what we know, because it was then that the sex crisis broke out in Ireland. It wasn't a pedophile, it wasn't a homosexual, it was a bishop by the name of Eamon Casey, who had a love affair in 1974 with an American. And guess what her name was? Annie Murphy, another Irish American. This is a story of nothing but Irish Americans. He fathered a child by her, and then he deserted her, and then the story got out, and it was a big scandal. Okay, it's a big scandal. Now, is fathering a child out of wedlock wrong? Yes, it's wrong. Does the Green Party say it's wrong? No, they don't say it's wrong. Who says it's wrong? The Catholic Church says it's wrong. But if it's wrong across the board. Now let's talk about institutions that are intimately connected with fathering children out of wedlock. Have you ever heard of basketball? Have you ever heard of the NBA, the National Basketball Association? Name one organization that produces more illegitimate children pro capita than the NBA. And yet there are no lawsuits against the NBA. Mary Kenny noticed this. She wrote a book called Goodbye to Catholic Ireland. And when this started, she just dismissed it. She said, oh, this has always been happening. And then this thing started to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And wave upon wave of charges and convictions. And nearly all of these people were convicted as charged. And she goes on to say, it was relentless, squalid, and depressing. The Brendan Smythe case was not only squalid and depressing, it brought down the government of Albert Reynolds. It was particularly shocking just because the offender was apparently incorrigible pedophile, but because there was evidence that the religious authorities had covered up for him for over a number of years. And so the ball then started rolling in Ireland. This ball never rolls unless someone is behind it, pushing it. And over the course of time, it became clear who was pushing it. The Brendan Smythe episode was, in Mary Kenny's words, yet another onslaught in the ongoing decline and fall of the Catholic Church. Before long, it was becoming clear that the same playbook was being used on both sides of the Atlantic. In both Ireland and America, the arsonists were on the fire department payroll. This is true not only of the Fourth Estate, which promoted the sexualization of Ireland, and therefore Ireland's clergy in the first place, but also of the psychological counseling establishment. After creating the crisis by undermining the morals of the clergy, the psychology counseling establishment got to cash in on the settlements by offering therapy to the victims. It is an irony not lost on Mary Kenny. £1 million was immediately spent on a helpline and counseling after the abuse victims of the industrial schools mentioned in the Suffer the Little Children were opened. It was ironic that the Catholic Church was using the very psychotherapeutic techniques which 50 years previously it had so condemned in the works of Sigmund Freud. What changed during those 50 years? What changed was the idea that the church had enemies. After the 1960s, the church convinced itself that it had no enemies. Once this happened, the feminists in Ireland volunteered to be willing executioners for the therapeutic state. Nell McCafferty, a Derry radical and nationally known feminist, was both more vehement and more explicit than her colleague at the Sunday Independent. McCafferty wrote that Catholic priests had lost all entitlement to discourse upon sexual morality. Next time they open their mouths on love, sex, contraception, abortion, homosexuality, pleasure, on anything that goes on between consenting healthy adults, their words should be publicly quoted back to them. Now let them shut up while people put themselves and their families back together again and knock some delicious, loving sexual pleasure out of life. You're telling us something about yourself there now? In the meantime, beware the local priest. He is a danger to your mental, physical, and sexual health. Never leave a child alone with him, not ever. What you see here is that in England, both in Ireland and America, the feminists functioned as the shock troops of the New World Order by claiming that the church had no authority to speak on sexual matters. That was soon extended to include all instances of morality, which of course included any condemnations of avarice, theft, and looting, behaviors which characterize capitalism, which was then waiting in the wings to fill the moral vacuum which the feminists had just created by undermining the authority of the Catholic Church. So the same thing that happened with the counter-revolution in America, with the neocon takeover, with neocon money, which would bribe the Catholics not to talk about economics and not to talk about the war in Iraq, and to use the Pope's failure to discipline the pedophile priests as an example why they should not listen to the Pope on the war in Iraq. All of that got transposed to Ireland as well. Or, as Mary Kenny put it, market capitalism, which is essential to the Celtic Tiger boom, depends on individual lifestyle choices, initiative, tolerance of diversity. It also depends on people valuing, not rebuffing, material gain. The authoritarianism of the Catholic Church, with its strong tradition and concept of orthodoxy, is anathema to the market. Individualism is essential. Those of us studied their Max Weber would say, he wrote the Protestant Ethic and the Work Ethic and the Rise of Capitalism, would say that it was not coincidental that Catholicism receded as capitalism triumphed. They would say it was necessary for Catholicism to recede in order for capitalism to triumph. The Protestant mindset that you make your own choices for salvation, bypassing any form of priestcraft, is a cultural precondition for free market capitalism. Were there any conspiracy theory Trotskyites left under the age of 60, they might almost suspect a capitalist plot to discredit the priests to free Ireland from market capitalism. I thought that was the best analysis that I had read of both what was going on in Ireland and in America. By 2000, Mammon had replaced the Catholic Church as the organizing principle for Irish society. She quotes then a special Sunday Times survey of Irish 30-year-olds claiming that for the young Irish, quote, money is the new religion, and they're queuing up to pay homage to the folding stuff. God plays second fiddle to Bill Gates, while sin is forgetting to nail down decent equity options. This generation is more likely to worship at a stock exchange than at a cathedral, to seek a pension advisor than a confessor. This, by the way, was written at the height of the Celtic Tiger boom, which I hear has passed. I got an email yesterday announcing that the Irish Irish were number one in the world in debt. Their debt is 1,275% of gross national product. So that's a lot to pay off, fellas. Good luck on paying that off. She also mentions Angela's ashes as part of this campaign to discredit Catholic Ireland, and mentions the curious story of the usurer. I don't know if you've seen Angela's ashes, but there's a usurer, a moneylender. Well, they walk into the house of the moneylender, and there are pictures of the Sacred Heart all over. Well, wait a minute. The moneylenders didn't have pictures of the Sacred Heart on their walls, did they? Irish people, she goes on to say that it was the Jews who were the usurers in Ireland. But this gets turned on its head because the purpose of Angela's ashes is to discredit the institution that is going to prevent the triumph of the moneylenders and the triumph of mammon in this country. Now, I tried this. I have been involved in this struggle for my entire professional life, which is now going on 30 years. So in 1988, which was probably the middle point of this crisis, I was wrote an article for, it was called Fidelity then, but it's the same magazine, about the head of the liturgy department at Notre Dame University. He was found shot to death in the basement of his house, 2 blocks from my house. And he was surrounded by whips and chains and homosexual pornography and automatic weapons, one of which had been used to kill him. And so no one knew at this point whether he had been shot to death by somebody picked up or had committed suicide. So I wrote the article and was invited to a conference. I used to be invited to conferences back then. And one of the participants in the conference was Cardinal Law of Boston. And I went up to him and I gave him the article. And the next day we all came down for breakfast, and I'm eager for approval from the hierarchy. So I say to His Eminence, "Well, what'd you think of the article about the dead homosexual liturgist?" He said to me, "What good does this serve? Why are you airing the church's dirty laundry?" Well, you know what? I'd like to see Cardinal Law again. Of course, I'll have to go to Rome to see him. He's not in Boston anymore because he was run out of town by the people who crucified the church because he did nothing about Father Shanley and 2 or 3 other people. Father Shanley, by the way, who was praised by the Boston Globe in the 1970s for his innovative youth ministry.
Not the man that they praised. Now, if they had done something, I'm not trying to get Cardinal Law off the hook, but if he had done something early on, guess who would have been the first to line up and defend Father Shanley? It would have been the Boston Globe defending his innovative youth ministry. Okay. That's the story. Let's conclude about asking what is the proper response to the sex abuse crisis in Ireland and America. Yes, the church was derelict in not preaching the gospel, especially on sexual matters. Yes, the church chose therapy over the penal sanctions required by canon law. Yes, the church is being punished for following the advice of the psychologist. Yes, the current scandals are being orchestrated by the church's traditional enemies, Protestants and Jews, in order to destroy traditional cultures and make the world safe for capitalism and the universal rule of mammon. But what is the proper response? The answer is in the story in Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 35 to 41, the story of Jesus calming the storm. We are told that it began to blow and the waves were breaking into the boat so that it was almost swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, his head on the cushion, asleep. They woke him and said to him, "Master, do you not care? We are going to drown." And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Quiet now, be calm." And the wind dropped and all was calm again. Then he said to them, "Why are you so frightened? How is it that you have no faith?" They were filled with awe and said to one another, "Who can this be, even the wind and the sea obey him. All of the church fathers are unanimous in saying that the boat is the church, and the boat is going to be tossed about by storms, which is to say campaigns orchestrated by wicked men to destroy the church. St. Hilary of Poitiers writes that Christ, quote, bids us to be within the church and to be in peril until such time as returning in his splendor he shall give salvation to all the people. Meanwhile, the disciples are tossed by the wind and the waves, struggling against all the storms of this world, raised by the opposition of an unclean spirit. St. Augustine tells us to, quote, think of the boat as the church, and the stormy sea as this world. For when any of a wicked will and of great power proclaims a persecution against the church, then it is that a mighty wave rises against the boat of Christ. We are to remain in that storm-tossed boat until, quote, when the night is nearly ended, he shall come, in the end of the world, when the night of iniquity is past, to judge the quick and the dead. When Christ finally does come, according to St. Hilary, he will find his church wearied and tossed by the spirit of the Antichrist and by the troubles of this world. And because by long experience of Antichrist they will be troubled at every novelty of trial, they shall have fear even at the approach of the Lord, suspecting deceitful appearances. But the good Lord banishes their fear by saying, it is I. And by proof of his presence, he takes away their dread of impending shipwreck. From the perspective of the faithful who have to endure these storms, it always seems as if Jesus is asleep, which is to say, unconcerned with their plight and unconcerned with the plight of the church. This, of course, is not the case. God is always with his church, even when it appears that he is not. Jumping ship means instant death, because God can calm any storm. The real issue is not the magnitude of the storm, but rather, as Jesus points out, the magnitude of our faith. Thank you. That's what that book is about. And it begins with the French Revolution, and it goes all the way up to the to what was then the present. It's available at culturewars.com. If you go there, you can buy it through PayPal. It's in paperback now, and I have that story. I have the whole Rockefeller-Hesburgh story in there. I have a lot of the stories that I've told in there with footnotes, and you can beat your friends over the head with it, and they will be convinced after that. But the